What would you do if the people who raised you, who shaped every part of your life, who loved you unconditionally, were suddenly gone, violently, tragically, and at the hands of someone you called family? It's the kind of question that makes your chest tighten, your mind spin, and your heart ache. For most of us, it's unthinkable. Yet, for the Reiner family, this nightmare became a horrifying reality on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Rob Reiner, the legendary actor and director, and his beloved wife Michelle Singer were found stabbed to death in their luxurious $13.5 million estate. The tragedy sent shockwaves across Hollywood and the world. But the story doesn't end there. The person arrested for this unimaginable act was none other than their son, Nick Reiner, a man the public knew as a Reiner, a part of a family synonymous with Hollywood success, creativity, and charisma. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The Reiners had long been a household name. Rob Reiner, the director of classic films that defined generations, was more than an actor or a filmmaker. He was a cultural icon. His wife, Michelle, had been his steadfast partner, a woman who balanced the chaos of Hollywood with grace and compassion. Together, they built not just a family, but a legacy. Their children, Nick, Jake, Romy, and Tracy, were raised in the glow of this legacy, with a childhood that seemed privileged and enviable. The world saw a happy family, unshakable and united. But beneath the surface, something darker was brewing, a tension that would erupt into a tragedy no one could have foreseen. The day the world learned of the Reiners' deaths was December 14, 2025, a Sunday that started like any other. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. The sun shone over the manicured lawns of Brentwood, and the city was unaware that its streets had just witnessed a family unraveling in the most shocking way. It was Romy, one of Rob and Michelle's daughters, who first discovered the horrifying scene. The image of her parents, the people who had been her guiding lights, lying lifeless in the home she had once visited so often, is something that no one can easily erase from memory. The shock, the disbelief, the raw, unbearable grief. It's the kind of moment that changes a person forever. As news spread, disbelief turned to horror. How could something like this happen in one of the most affluent, seemingly safe neighborhoods in Los Angeles? And how could the alleged perpetrator be Nick, the youngest son, a man of 32 who lived in the guest house on the property? The very thought challenged the public's understanding of family, love, and loyalty. For Hollywood insiders, this was a bombshell. For the Reiners' children, it was the shattering of a world they thought was secure, an irreparable rupture that left them grappling with confusion and grief in equal measure. Public reaction was immediate. News outlets, social media, and Hollywood gossip columns exploded with speculation. Headlines screamed about the alleged murder, the shocking betrayal, and the tragedy of a family renowned for its artistic contributions. Rolling Stone reported early on the details of Nick's arrest. He was taken into custody at 9:15 p.m. after the Los Angeles Police Department determined he was responsible for the deaths. 2 counts of first-degree murder were filed against him, and the weight of the potential sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole or even the death penalty, hung heavy over the entire family. And yet, despite the public spectacle, the surviving Reiner children, Jake and Romy, chose to issue a statement that combined heartbreak, gratitude, and a plea for privacy. Their words were stark, raw, and deeply human. Words cannot even begin to describe the unimaginable pain we are experiencing every moment of the day, the statement read. The horrific and devastating loss of our parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, is something that no one should ever experience. It's a declaration that no one reading could ignore, a glimpse into a grief so deep it defies comprehension. They continued, expressing gratitude for the outpouring of support from all corners of life, friends, family, and strangers alike, but also asking for compassion over speculation, urging the public to remember their parents for the lives they lived, the love they gave, and not for the sensational tragedy that consumed headlines. Yet, even as Jake and Romy mourned, questions mounted. How could such a horrific act occur? What was Nick's state of mind? What were the events leading up to that Sunday afternoon? Every detail became a point of speculation. The life Nick led in the guest house, the dynamics between him and his parents, the relationships with his siblings. Analysts, psychologists, and the media began dissecting every known fact, searching for patterns, motives, or warning signs. But grief and shock clouded everything, leaving the public and family alike navigating a maze of uncertainty. Amid the chaos, the legal proceedings loomed. Nick's defense attorney, Alan Jackson, confirmed that his client had not been medically cleared to be transported to court at the time of his initial arraignment. The courtroom, already a stage for dramatic revelations, was about to become a theater of grief, remorse, and shocking disclosures. For a family used to handling the public eye with grace and charm, this was uncharted territory. The cameras would roll, the public would watch, and every word spoken could shape perceptions of guilt, innocence, and character. As we begin to unravel this story, consider the human element. This isn't just a headline. This is a family, a tragedy, and a series of events that challenge our understanding of loyalty, love, and morality. Imagine being in Tracy's shoes, watching her brother stand accused of killing their parents. Imagine the torment of Romy, having found the bodies, and then having to process both grief and the shock of betrayal. Every glance, every whisper, every courtroom exchange adds another layer to a narrative that is both heartbreaking and impossible to look away from. The public may focus on the crime itself, the sensationalism of Hollywood tragedy, but there is a deeper story here. A story of family, guilt, grief, and the human capacity to face incomprehensible loss. We will explore the events leading up to the tragedy, the courtroom apologies, and the revelations that shook not just the Reiner family, but a captivated world watching from afar. Through detailed storytelling, personal anecdotes, and courtroom drama, we will dissect how a family celebrated for its love, artistry, and influence could be torn apart in the most shocking way imaginable. And yet, for all the sorrow, there is a thread of humanity that runs through this narrative. The surviving siblings have shown courage in their public statements, vulnerability in their grief, and a call for compassion in a world often quick to judge. The courtroom, the evidence, and the media may dominate the narrative, but at its heart, this is a story about people, their flaws, their heartbreaks, and the unthinkable moments that test the limits of familial bonds. But what makes this story truly gripping is not just the tragedy itself. It's the unfolding revelations, the hidden tensions, the courtroom moments, and the confessions that promise to shed light on a darkness no one fully understood until now. What exactly happened that day? How did a son allegedly turn on the parents who loved him most? What secrets will emerge as Nick and Tracy speak in court? These are questions that will drive our journey through this story, and the answers are far from simple. Stay with me, because the next chapters will take you into the heart of the Reiner family, into their world before the tragedy, the dynamics that shaped their lives, and the fateful moments that led to the unthinkable. Each revelation will challenge what you thought you knew. Each testimony will push the limits of empathy, and each detail will add depth to a story that is as heartbreaking as it is shocking. This is more than a story of crime. It is a story of family, of legacy, of love lost, and of humanity tested to its breaking point. And as we delve into the lives of Rob and Michelle Reiner, their children, and the shocking events that changed everything, you will find yourself asking, what would you do if you were in their shoes? How do you reconcile love with betrayal, grief with anger, and the unthinkable with reality? Before tragedy struck, the Reiner family seemed untouchable. Rob Reiner was more than a Hollywood star. He was a force of nature in the entertainment industry, a man whose name alone carried weight, prestige, and expectation. From his early days as an actor on All in the Family to directing timeless classics like When Harry Met Sally and A Few Good Men, Rob's career had a trajectory that most could only dream of. But behind the spotlight and the accolades, there was a family, a wife, Michelle Singer, and their children, who knew a side of Rob that the world rarely saw. A side full of warmth, humor, and unshakable devotion. Michelle, his partner in life, balanced Hollywood's pressures with grace and empathy. She was more than a support system. She was the glue that held the family together through the highs and lows of fame. Those who knew her described Michelle as loving, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her children. Together, Rob and Michelle created not just a household, but a legacy that was envied by many, a home filled with love, laughter, and creative energy. Their children grew up under the glow of Hollywood privilege. Nick, the youngest, lived in the guest house of the Brentwood estate, an environment that combined the comfort of family support with the pressures of legacy. Jake and Romy, older siblings, had their own paths, but all were undeniably influenced by their father's fame and mother's steadiness. Tracy, another part of this intricate family dynamic, carried her own experiences and emotions, navigating the balance between public curiosity and private grief. On the surface, their life was a portrait of perfection. The estate was immaculate, the parties were glamorous yet tasteful, and the public appearances of the family were polished, warm, and full of charm. Hollywood looked at them and saw the ideal family: successful parents, talented children, and a home that radiated both stability and prestige. But as anyone who has grown up in the shadow of celebrity knows, appearances can be deceiving. Fame brings its own pressures, expectations, and unseen tensions. Rob was not just a father and husband. He was a mentor, a leader, and, in many ways, a public figure whose actions were scrutinized by millions. This scrutiny inevitably seeped into family life. How do you grow up in a household where your father is celebrated worldwide, your mother constantly mediates between privacy and attention, and your siblings navigate their own roles within this microcosm of fame? It's a unique pressure, one that can forge closeness, but also quietly breed resentment, stress, and complex dynamics that outsiders rarely understand. Nick, Jake, Romy, and Tracy each had their own relationships with their parents. Romy, who discovered her parents' bodies, had a closeness with them that was deeply emotional and personal. She witnessed both their public triumphs and private tenderness. Jake carried both pride and responsibility as an older sibling, balancing grief with the weight of legacy. Tracy, like the others, had a unique vantage point, watching and experiencing the family's inner workings in ways the public could not. Each child held fragments of the family's story, pieces that would later be vital in understanding the tragedy that unfolded. Despite the glamour and seeming stability, subtle tensions often exist in families, and the Reiners were no exception. Celebrity families navigate a world where expectations are magnified, private struggles are amplified, and every action can become a headline. The children grew up with an awareness of public perception, of the constant need to maintain appearances while also managing the ordinary challenges of sibling rivalry, personal ambition, and the search for individual identity. These pressures, though invisible to the outside world, were real, persistent, and sometimes overwhelming. Even as the family celebrated milestones, birthdays, and achievements, there were glimpses of friction. Nick's life in the guest house, somewhat isolated from the main household, created its own dynamic. Distance, both physical and emotional, can magnify misunderstandings and unspoken conflicts. While the public never knew the full extent of the family's internal dynamics, the court and those close to the Reiners would later reveal that beneath the surface, challenges existed. Ones that might have contributed to the tragic events of December 14th. Hollywood history is littered with families who appear perfect in public but struggle privately. The Reiners' story, up until that Sunday, fit comfortably into the narrative of success and love. Rob's career had afforded them wealth, influence, and access to opportunities few could imagine. Michelle's guidance and presence provided stability. And the children, while navigating their individual paths, were part of a unit that seemed unbreakable. But what does it truly mean to grow up in the shadow of greatness? To live in a home where your father is celebrated for genius and charisma, your mother revered for strength and grace, and your every action scrutinized by public eyes? For the Reiner children, this reality shaped their identities in ways both visible and invisible. It shaped expectations, relationships, and, ultimately, the very dynamics that would play a role in the fateful events of December 14th. The Brentwood estate itself reflected this duality of beauty and isolation. Expansive lawns, high walls, and manicured gardens offered privacy and comfort, yet the same walls could contain unspoken tension. The guest house where Nick lived, separate from the main household, provided autonomy but also distance. both physical and emotional. From the rest of the family, it's easy to imagine how, in such a setting, emotions could fester, unresolved conflicts could accumulate, and misunderstandings could escalate without immediate reconciliation. Despite these underlying challenges, family life was not without love. Moments of joy, celebration, and tenderness existed, creating memories that would haunt the surviving children after the tragedy. Picture birthdays filled with laughter, holidays with warmth, quiet afternoons of shared stories and lessons. These moments were real, cherished, and human. They were the foundation that made the later tragedy so incomprehensible. A family capable of such love, now shattered beyond repair. And yet, Hollywood families are often defined by dual realities, the public persona and the private truth. For the Reiners, the world saw the public persona, a united, loving, glamorous family. Behind closed doors, there were complexities, nuances, and struggles that would remain hidden until tragedy forced them into the open. The events of December 14th peeled back that veneer, revealing that even in a household built on love and legacy, the human heart can contain turmoil that no one fully understands. As we explore this story, it's important to remember that fame and wealth cannot shield a family from pain, conflict, or tragedy. The Reiner's life, filled with privilege and recognition, was no exception. The intricate web of relationships, expectations, and pressures created a context in which events could spiral beyond anyone's control. Each family member had a role, each decision mattered, and each unspoken tension contributed to the chain of events that culminated in one of the most shocking tragedies Hollywood has ever witnessed. But even as we reflect on their life before the tragedy, questions arise that demand answers. How did the family's dynamic shape Nick's choices? What role did isolation, expectations, or misunderstandings play in the unraveling of events? And most importantly, how does a family with so much love, so much connection, arrive at a point where violence and loss become reality? The Reiner legacy is not just about films, awards, or celebrity. It is about people, relationships, and the fragile nature of family life. Rob and Michelle built a life full of promise and affection. Their children grew up in an environment shaped by love, discipline, and opportunity. But beneath the surface, complexities existed, emotional, psychological, and relational, that the public could not see. Those complexities would become central to understanding the events that followed. And now, as we move forward into the story, keep in mind this duality. The Reiners were a family capable of immense love and devastating tragedy. The life they built, the relationships they nurtured, and the tensions they navigated all form the backdrop against which December 14th unfolded. Every detail, every anecdote, every hidden layer of family history brings us closer to understanding not only what happened, but why it mattered, and why it would leave an indelible mark on everyone connected to the Reiners. But what no one expected, and what would soon become painfully clear, was that the events of that fateful Sunday would unravel a family narrative that had seemed perfect, exposing tensions, grief, and a sequence of choices that would shock the world. The legacy of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the love and heartbreak woven through decades, and the unimaginable actions of their son Nick would create a story that Hollywood and the public could not look away from. It started like any other Sunday in Brentwood. The sun hung low over the manicured streets. Neighbors went about their routines, and the world outside the Reiner estate had no hint of the horror that was about to unfold behind its high walls. For most, Sunday is a day of rest, of family breakfasts, and of quiet reflection. For the Reiner family, December 14th, 2025, would become the day that redefined everything, a day when life and death collided in a way that no one could have imagined. Romy Reiner, daughter of Rob and Michelle, entered the home that afternoon expecting the normalcy of family life. Perhaps she had planned a casual visit, perhaps a chat with her parents, or simply checking in on the property she had long been familiar with. What she encountered instead was a scene so chilling it would haunt her for the rest of her life. The bodies of her parents, Rob and Michelle, lay in the home, victims of a violent act that defied reason. The realization that this tragedy had occurred within the walls of her own family estate was incomprehensible. Imagine the shock, the disbelief, and the gut-wrenching horror of such a discovery. One moment, your parents are alive, vibrant, and central to your world. The next, they are gone, and the circumstances point to something unthinkable, that their own son may have been responsible. This moment, where personal tragedy intersects with the grotesque, is the kind that transforms ordinary grief into public fascination and scrutiny. For Romy, there was no time to process, no way to prepare. Every step, every glance, every heartbeat became a reminder of loss that felt both immediate and surreal. News of the discovery spread rapidly. The Los Angeles Police Department arrived promptly, but the sense of normalcy had already been shattered. Officers and investigators moved carefully through the estate, documenting the scene, preserving evidence, and piecing together a timeline that would soon confirm everyone's worst fears. This was not an ordinary investigation. The alleged suspect was Nick Reiner, the youngest son of the household, a man who had lived on the property in the guest house for years. The implications were staggering. Family, law enforcement, and the public were forced to confront a narrative that seemed almost impossible to believe: a son accused of taking the lives of his parents. The arrest occurred at 9:15 p.m. local time, mere hours after the discovery. By then, the story had already dominated news cycles, social media feeds, and casual conversations across the city. The details were both horrifying and captivating. How did Nick, a man who appeared to lead a relatively normal life within a high-profile family, come to be implicated in such a violent act? What factors had led to this moment? Personal struggles, family tension, or hidden crises that no one outside the family could have seen? These questions dominated the public imagination, yet the answers remained elusive. As the world absorbed the shock, the surviving children, Jake and Romy, were faced with the dual burden of grief and public attention. In a statement issued shortly after Nick's arrest, they expressed both sorrow and humanity. "Words cannot even begin to describe the unimaginable pain we are experiencing every moment of the day," they wrote. The statement captured the rawness of their loss, acknowledging that their parents had been more than just caregivers. They had been best friends, confidants, and sources of unwavering love. This duality, the horror of the act and the love of the family, would become a recurring theme as the story unfolded in the media and courtroom. The public reaction was intense. Hollywood insiders, fans, and casual observers alike were captivated by the juxtaposition of glamour and tragedy. The Reiners had long been admired for their work, their family values, and their public personas. Now, those qualities were juxtaposed with incomprehensible loss and suspicion. Social media erupted with speculation, both empathetic and sensational. Headlines demanded answers, while commentary sections debated motives, mental health, and the possibility of hidden family conflict. The tragedy was no longer just a private matter. It had become a public spectacle, a story that blurred the lines between grief, fascination, and judgment. Within the estate itself, the shock was palpable. Police investigators worked meticulously to reconstruct the events of the day. Every room, every surface, and every interaction was scrutinized for clues. Forensic experts analyzed the scene, seeking evidence that could confirm timelines, motives, and potential involvement. The process was methodical, painstaking, and emotionally charged. Each discovery, no matter how small, carried the weight of life-altering consequences. But the human element remained central. For the surviving siblings, grief was interwoven with disbelief. How could a family known for its love, humor, and stability experience such a fracture? How could someone they called a brother allegedly commit such an act? These questions were not abstract. They were deeply personal, pressing, and impossible to ignore. The siblings' responses, their statements, public appearances, and private reflections, would later become critical in understanding both the emotional and psychological dimensions of the tragedy. As the investigation progressed, the narrative became increasingly complex. The public learned that Nick had lived in the guest house, somewhat removed from the main household, which provided both independence and isolation. The significance of this detail would later emerge as investigators and court officials explored the nuances of family dynamics, personal struggles, and potential warning signs that may have been missed or misunderstood. The story was no longer simply about a crime. It had evolved into a multifaceted examination of human behavior, family relationships, and the consequences of hidden tensions. Even in the midst of tragedy, the media and public demanded answers. The Los Angeles Police Department confirmed that Nick had been responsible for the deaths of his parents, and the Los Angeles County District Attorney outlined the charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder. The potential penalties, including life without the possibility of parole or the death penalty, underscored the gravity of the situation. Yet, despite the legal clarity, the emotional and psychological questions remained unresolved. How could such an act occur within a family so publicly admired? What role did private struggles, misunderstandings, or mental health challenges play in the chain of events that led to this Sunday afternoon catastrophe? The surviving children's response offered a window into the human heart amidst chaos. Jake and Romy emphasized the importance of compassion, urging the public to temper speculation with empathy. They expressed gratitude for the support they received, acknowledging the kindness of friends, family, and strangers alike. Their words reflected not just grief, but a recognition of the broader human context, that loss, shock, and tragedy are universal experiences, even when they occur within families of fame and fortune. Yet, for all the public statements and media coverage, the scene of the crime remained a focal point of horror and fascination. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of love, stability, and achievement, had become a stage for tragedy, investigation, and public speculation. Each detail of that day, the timing, the discovery, the arrest, contributed to a narrative that was both compelling and devastating. The juxtaposition of wealth and violence, public image and private pain, created a story that seemed almost cinematic in its intensity, yet painfully real in its consequences. As the investigation unfolded, the human dimensions of the tragedy became increasingly apparent. Family members, friends, and associates began to speak of the Reiners not just as celebrities, but as people whose lives were full of love, conflict, and complexity. The emotional weight of the event, combined with the legal ramifications, transformed a private horror into a story of universal resonance. One that challenges assumptions about family, loyalty, and the human capacity for both love and violence. What made this day particularly brutal was not just the act itself, but the context in which it occurred. The Reiners were a family celebrated for their cohesion, creativity, and mutual support. The notion that such a family could be fractured in this way forced everyone, friends, media, and the public, to reconsider their assumptions about what they thought they knew. Grief, shock, and the search for understanding became intertwined, creating a narrative that was as emotionally gripping as it was tragic. But the story did not end with the discovery of the crime. The arrest, the legal proceedings, and the eventual courtroom appearances would reveal layers of complexity that no one had anticipated. Every detail of that brutal Sunday would be dissected, analyzed, and contextualized in ways that added depth, suspense, and a chilling sense of inevitability to the unfolding tragedy. And yet, even amid the horror, there was a human story that demanded attention. The story of siblings grappling with unimaginable grief, of a family attempting to reconcile love with betrayal, and of a public force to confront the fragility of life behind the veneer of fame. The events of that Sunday would set the stage for courtroom revelations, public apologies, and the unraveling of a family narrative that had seemed perfect until the moment of tragedy. How could a son allegedly turn on the parents who gave him life, love, and support? It's a question that has haunted everyone following the Reiner tragedy, and it is the question that frames the story of Nick Reiner. At 32, Nick had grown up in the shadow of his father, Rob Reiner, a man whose career and public image loomed large over the family. To the outside world, he was part of a successful, talented, and seemingly loving family. But within that very household, the events that would unfold on December 14th revealed fractures that the public could not have imagined. Nick's upbringing was, by most accounts, typical of a child in a Hollywood family. He experienced the privileges of wealth and opportunity, the advantages of a household filled with creative energy, and the influence of parents who had devoted themselves to both career and family. Yet, privilege does not shield someone from human frailty, nor does it prevent struggles with mental health, personal identity, or complex familial relationships. These factors, unseen and often unspoken, began to form the backdrop of a tragedy that would soon capture the world's attention. Nick lived in the guest house of the Reiner estate, a detail that seemed innocuous but carried significant implications. Living separately from the main household provided independence, but it also created a form of isolation. Physical separation from his parents and siblings may have contributed to misunderstandings, emotional distance, or feelings of alienation. While the public saw a young man living comfortably within a famous family, the private reality was more nuanced. A reality that investigators and later court proceedings would explore in detail. The day the bodies were discovered, law enforcement quickly moved to assess Nick's involvement. At 9:15 p.m., he was arrested by the Los Angeles Police Department, officially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The gravity of these charges cannot be overstated. First-degree murder implies premeditation, intent, and a deliberate act. It is the most serious charge a person can face, and in Los Angeles County, it carries the possibility of life imprisonment without parole or even the death penalty. For a family already reeling from the shock of losing Rob and Michelle, these legal realities compounded the emotional devastation. Public reaction to Nick's arrest was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with speculation, debates, and emotional commentary. Headlines demanded answers, while forums and comment sections dissected every available detail. The narrative quickly split. Some expressed sympathy for Nick, highlighting potential struggles with mental health or isolation. Others expressed outrage, struggling to reconcile the notion that a son could allegedly commit such a heinous act against his parents. The polarizing nature of public opinion added yet another layer of pressure to a family already engulfed in grief. Nick's personal life, largely private until this point, became a subject of scrutiny. While little was publicly known about his day-to-day routines or personal struggles, his position within the Reiner family offered clues for analysts and the media. Observers began piecing together timelines, reviewing interactions, and exploring reports of past conflicts. Questions arose. Were there warning signs? Did family members notice changes in behavior? How did the dynamics of growing up in a high-profile household shape Nick's emotional world? These inquiries, while speculative, highlighted the complex intersection of privilege, familial expectations, and individual psychology. The role of mental health quickly became a focal point in understanding Nick's alleged actions. Court proceedings revealed that he had not been medically cleared to be transported to his initial court appearance, suggesting that concerns about his physical or psychological state were being considered. This detail added nuance to public perceptions of guilt and responsibility. Was Nick acting under duress, psychological distress, or a breakdown that went unnoticed until it culminated in tragedy? Experts in psychology and criminal behavior would later weigh in, emphasizing the importance of context in assessing criminal responsibility. Yet, legal proceedings also emphasized accountability. The Los Angeles County District Attorney, Nathan Hochman, stated clearly that Nick was responsible for the deaths and that the charges carried the maximum penalties allowed under the law. The tension between legal culpability and personal struggle created a narrative that was both emotionally charged and legally complex. The courtroom would become a stage not only for evidence, but for human stories, apologies, testimonies, and revelations that would shape public perception in ways no headline could capture. The media portrayal of Nick oscillated between villain and victim. Early coverage emphasized the shocking nature of the alleged crime, framing him as the perpetrator of a violent act against his own parents. Yet, other outlets sought to provide context, examining his upbringing, family dynamics, and potential struggles with mental health. This duality, the combination of culpability and vulnerability, would define much of the narrative as the story unfolded in real time. The public was forced to grapple with uncomfortable questions about family, morality, and the human capacity for both love and violence. Even within the Reiner family, the allegations complicated personal relationships. Jake and Romy, in their public statements, acknowledged their grief and the complexity of the situation. They expressed sorrow not only for their parents but for their brother, emphasizing the humanity of everyone involved. This response highlighted the delicate balance the surviving siblings faced, mourning their parents while processing the reality that the alleged perpetrator was someone they had loved and known intimately. The emotional weight of this duality cannot be overstated. Investigators focused on establishing a clear timeline of events leading up to December 14th. Forensic evidence, witness statements, and analysis of the estate were all critical in understanding the sequence of events. Each detail, from the positioning of the bodies to the timing of Nick's movements, became a puzzle piece in the investigation. While the public could only speculate, law enforcement and legal teams worked to reconstruct the day in meticulous detail. These findings would later become central to courtroom proceedings, shaping both the legal strategy and the narrative presented to the world. Public fascination with Nick's story also reflected a broader human interest in understanding motives. Why would someone allegedly commit such an act against their parents? Was it anger, desperation, mental instability, or some combination of factors? Human psychology is complex, and the interplay between familial expectation, personal struggle, and perceived injustice can create scenarios that are difficult to comprehend. Experts in criminal behavior and family dynamics later analyzed Nick's background, offering insights into how a person might reach a breaking point under pressure, isolation, and internal conflict. Nick's arrest also highlighted the role of procedural justice. The LAPD ensured that the arrest was conducted in accordance with the law, while the DA's office prepared for the formal charging process. Defense attorney Alan Jackson emphasized that Nick had not yet been medically cleared for court, underscoring the importance of due process and the legal consideration of health and well-being. These procedural details, while technical, added depth to the narrative, revealing the intersection of law, human frailty, and the complexities of managing a high-profile case. The story of Nick Reiner is not simply a story of alleged crime. It is a story of human vulnerability, family dynamics, and the unpredictable ways in which personal and emotional struggles can escalate. It is also a story that challenges public assumptions about morality, loyalty, and the capacity for violence within a family unit. The tension between love and betrayal, privilege and isolation, and accountability and vulnerability is what makes this narrative both compelling and heartbreaking. As we prepare to explore the responses of the surviving siblings, the public, and the courtroom, keep in mind this essential truth. Nick Reiner is at the center of a story that is as much about human complexity as it is about crime. The decisions, behaviors, and circumstances leading up to December 14th are multifaceted, intertwined with the Reiner family legacy, and colored by the pressures of fame, expectation, and isolation. Understanding Nick's role requires examining both the evidence and the emotional context, a task that is challenging, necessary, and deeply human. And yet, even as investigators, lawyers, and the public sought to understand Nick, the courtroom would soon reveal layers of emotion, regret, and revelation that no one could have predicted. Apologies, confessions, and unspoken truths would emerge, offering glimpses into the human heart behind the alleged crime. These moments would force everyone involved, family, friends, and observers, to confront the painful complexity of love, betrayal, and grief. The world was watching. Cameras, reporters, social media feeds, all were focused on the Reiner family after the shocking events of December 14th. But amid the speculation, gossip, and mounting headlines, the voices that truly mattered were those of the surviving children. Jake and Romy Reiner had endured what most cannot even imagine. The sudden, violent loss of their parents and the allegation that their brother, Nick, was responsible. Their silence until this point had been deliberate, a shield against the media storm. But now, grief and the weight of responsibility compelled them to speak, to share their truth with a world desperate for answers. Their statement was brief but packed with emotional intensity. Words cannot even begin to describe the unimaginable pain we are experiencing every moment of the day, they wrote. These words were not for headlines, not for sensationalism, but for the acknowledgement of a grief that defies logic. Losing a parent is devastating. Losing both simultaneously is unimaginable. And losing them under circumstances that implicate your own sibling creates a fracture in the human psyche that few can comprehend. The The statement went on to highlight the multifaceted role Rob and Michelle played in their lives. Not just as parents, but as friends, confidants, and sources of unconditional love. They weren't just our parents, they were our best friends, the statement read. This line alone encapsulated the depth of loss, illustrating that the tragedy was not merely a physical absence, but an emotional and psychological rupture. The surviving siblings were grappling with the void left behind, a void amplified by shock, betrayal, and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. Jake and Romy also emphasized gratitude amidst their grief. In the midst of horror, kindness had emerged. Friends, family, and even strangers had reached out with condolences, support, and empathy. This acknowledgement reflects a critical human need to find connection and solace even in the darkest times. By recognizing the support of the broader community, Jake and Romy reminded us that grief is not only personal but collective. It invites empathy and shared humanity. It is also worth noting the courage required to speak under these circumstances. The surviving siblings were navigating trauma, shock, and public scrutiny simultaneously. By choosing to make a statement, they exercised agency, communicated their truth, and asserted boundaries around their private pain. In doing so, they not only honored their parents' memory, but also laid the groundwork for understanding the family dynamics that would later emerge in the courtroom. The statement also highlighted the enduring importance of family love, even amid tragedy. By emphasizing that their parents were their best friends, Jake and Romy reminded the world that the foundation of their grief was not merely familial obligation, but genuine affection, trust, and intimacy. This human dimension would resonate throughout the unfolding story, influencing how the public, media, and legal system interpreted the events and responses of all involved. As the media dissected the statement, new questions arose. How would Nick respond? What role did family dynamics play in the lead-up to the tragedy? Could the surviving siblings maintain their privacy and emotional well-being in the midst of relentless public attention? These questions would drive the narrative forward, creating suspense, anticipation, and emotional resonance. And yet, for all the clarity provided by their statement, there remained an underlying tension. The human need to understand the unthinkable. Jake and Romy expressed grief and requested compassion, but the world still demanded answers. How could this family, celebrated for its unity and love, experience such a rupture? What had led to this moment of tragedy, and what could be learned from the intersection of familial bonds, personal struggles, and unforeseen consequences? The courtroom is a place where stories unfold, truths are tested, and emotions collide with the cold precision of law. For the Reiner family, the courtroom was not just a legal arena. It became the stage on which grief, betrayal, and humanity would be laid bare for the world to witness. The drama began in the hours following Nick Reiner's arrest. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of his parents, Nick's entry into the judicial system set the tone for a saga that would captivate the nation. When Nick appeared in court for the first time, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Reporters, photographers, and cameras from every major network filled the room. The public watched in rapt attention, eager to witness the unfolding narrative. But beyond the spectacle, there was a human story at the center. A son accused of killing his parents, siblings watching in anguish, and a community grappling with shock. The courtroom, with its formalities and legal procedures, became a crucible for emotion, exposing raw grief, remorse, and the incomprehensible weight of what had transpired. Nick entered the courtroom in shackles, a suicide prevention smock over his shoulders. The image alone was jarring. A young man, part of a family celebrated for its achievements and cohesion, now reduced to a figure of vulnerability, fear, and suspicion. Observers could not help but wonder what was going through his mind at that moment. Was he aware of the gravity of the charges, or was he consumed by shock, guilt, and confusion? Every nuance of his posture, every glance toward family members, carried significance, creating a tension that was palpable to everyone present. The courtroom proceedings began with procedural formalities. Charges were read, legal representation was confirmed, and timelines were established. Defense attorney Alan Jackson explained that Nick had not yet been medically cleared for full participation in the proceedings, a detail that underscored the interplay between mental health and legal responsibility. In cases of extreme trauma or alleged violent behavior, courts are tasked with balancing the rights of the accused with the integrity of the judicial process. This delicate balance added layers of complexity to the story, highlighting that justice is not only about punishment but also about understanding human behavior. The initial appearances set the stage for a legal battle that would unfold over weeks, months, and perhaps years. But the emotional undercurrent was impossible to ignore. The surviving siblings, Jake and Romy, sat in the courtroom with visible anguish. Each moment was a struggle to reconcile grief with the demands of procedure. Every exchange between attorneys, judges, and the accused amplified the human dimension of the tragedy. While the law addressed the facts, evidence, charges, and legal arguments, the family's presence reminded all that real people, with lives forever altered, were at the heart of the case. Media coverage amplified the intensity. Close-up images of Nick, the courtroom layout, and the reactions of family members became part of the public narrative. Reporters dissected expressions, body language, and courtroom behavior, offering analysis that ranged from sympathetic to critical. Social media users engaged in real-time speculation, debating motives, mental state, and potential outcomes. The courtroom had become more than a site of legal proceedings. It had become a theater of emotion, perception, and collective fascination. One of the most emotionally charged aspects of the courtroom drama was the anticipation of apologies and explanations. Would Nick speak? Would he acknowledge the grief of his siblings? Would remorse or defense dominate his words? Every observer, both within the courtroom and across the country, waited for these moments of human vulnerability. Moments that could reveal not only truth, but also the depth of emotional complexity behind the alleged crime. Apologies in court are rare, powerful, and highly scrutinized. They are a bridge between personal responsibility and public perception. For Nick, any statement carried enormous weight. It could offer insight into motive, demonstrate contrition, or complicate legal strategy. The anticipation of what he might say created a charged atmosphere, one in which hope, fear, and curiosity intermingled. The surviving siblings, lawyers, and public alike were all poised for revelation. The courtroom also provided an opportunity to examine family dynamics in detail. Testimonies, evidence, and character statements offered glimpses into the Reiner household, revealing tensions, interactions, and moments of normalcy that had previously been private. Understanding the context of Nick's upbringing, his relationships with his parents and siblings, and the subtle pressures of growing up in a high-profile family became central to interpreting the alleged actions. Each witness, each piece of evidence, contributed to a mosaic of human behavior, a narrative that was as emotional as it was legal. Throughout the proceedings, the role of mental health remained a focal point. Experts were called to assess Nick's state of mind, offering insights into psychological stress, potential breakdowns, and the impact of familial dynamics on behavior. These evaluations were crucial in determining culpability, sentence considerations, and the potential for rehabilitation. The courtroom, therefore, became a space where law, psychology, and human emotion intersected, revealing the multifaceted nature of justice in cases of extreme tragedy. Public interest in the courtroom drama was fueled not only by the shocking nature of the crime, but by the human stories it revealed. Every expression of grief, every whispered conversation, and every procedural decision offered a window into lives irrevocably altered. The Reiners were more than celebrities. They were people navigating a surreal and devastating reality. The courtroom amplified this truth, turning legal procedure into a narrative of empathy, horror, and human complexity. Legal strategists also recognized the importance of narrative framing in the courtroom. How Nick was presented, how his behavior was interpreted, and how evidence was contextualized could all influence public perception and jury opinion. Defense and prosecution alike were aware that the court of public opinion often parallels, and sometimes intersects, with formal legal proceedings. Every motion, statement, and cross-examination became part of a larger story, one that blended law, emotion, and media scrutiny. Yet, amid the legal formalities, the human stories remained central. The surviving siblings, their expressions of grief, and the anticipation of Nick's potential apologies were constant reminders that this was not just a case. It was a family in crisis. Each testimony, piece of evidence, and courtroom interaction revealed not only facts, but also the emotional and psychological impact of events that had unfolded in the Reiner estate. The courtroom became a stage where human tragedy and legal process converged in ways that were both riveting and heartrending. As the days progressed, the courtroom drama intensified. Apologies were made, emotional statements were delivered, and previously private aspects of the family's life were revealed to the public. Each moment added depth, suspense, and a sense of immediacy to a narrative already charged with emotion. Observers were drawn into the human complexity behind the charges, grappling with grief, betrayal, and the search for understanding. And yet, even with all the procedural steps, evidence, and emotional displays, the story was far from over. The courtroom had become a crucible where legal arguments and human emotion intertwined, and every revelation, every word spoken by Nick, every response from his siblings, promised to alter the course of public perception. The courtroom was silent, but tension hung thick in the air, almost tangible. Everyone present, family, attorneys, media, and court staff, felt it. This was the moment the world had been waiting for, the first public acknowledgement from Nick Reiner himself. Would he speak? Would there be remorse, denial, explanation, or deflection? The stakes were immense, both legally and emotionally. After all, this was not merely a case about law. It was a case about human tragedy, betrayal, and the unraveling of a family that had once seemed untouchable. Nick's entrance into the courtroom was subdued but heavy with meaning. The shackles, the suicide prevention smock, and the guarded movements painted a picture of vulnerability, tension, and perhaps fear. As the judge called the proceedings to order, the atmosphere grew even more charged. Everyone in that room knew the gravity of what was about to unfold. They were about to witness the intersection of guilt, grief, and the possibility of redemption, a moment in which words could alter not only public perception, but the emotional trajectory of a family in crisis. When Nick finally spoke, his voice trembled. It was not the voice of a hardened criminal. It was the voice of a son confronting the unimaginable, the consequences of an act that had shattered his parents' lives and the lives of his siblings. He began with apologies, not just general statements, but direct, emotionally charged expressions of regret. "I am sorry for what has happened," he said, his tone heavy with the weight of realization. Each word was deliberate, each pause measured, as if he were acutely aware that he was addressing not only the court but his siblings and, symbolically, the memory of his parents. These apologies were more than legal formalities. They were an attempt at human connection, a way of bridging the impossible gap between action and consequence. Apologies in such circumstances are complex. They are a recognition of wrongdoing, a signal of remorse, and an invitation for reconciliation. Even if full reconciliation may never be possible. For Nick, the words carried layers of personal accountability, grief, and an acknowledgement of the irreversible impact of his actions. The courtroom held its collective breath. Media representatives documented every nuance, while the public consumed each detail in real time. But the emotional resonance was not in the headlines or the camera angles. It was in the raw vulnerability of a son speaking to his own family and, by extension, to the world. Apologies of this magnitude are rare, particularly in cases involving extreme familial violence. They serve as a reminder that even in acts of devastation, the human heart retains a capacity for reflection, contrition, and, perhaps, understanding. Nick's statements also included attempts to explain what had happened, not as justification, but as context. He spoke of personal struggles, isolation, and the pressures of living in a household defined by fame, expectation, and complex dynamics. These revelations, while not absolving him legally, provided a glimpse into the emotional and psychological pressures that had shaped his actions. The courtroom, in that moment, became a space not only for legal assessment, but for the public exploration of human behavior under extreme stress. The surviving siblings, Jake and Romy, listened with visible tension. Each apology, each explanation, elicited a complex array of emotions: sorrow, relief, confusion, and perhaps even a measure of empathy. Grief in such circumstances is not linear. It is multifaceted and contradictory. To love a sibling while grappling with their alleged actions requires a delicate balance between anger, understanding, and mourning. The courtroom became a crucible in which these emotions were exposed, processed, and, in some ways, legitimized. Psychologists observing the proceedings noted the importance of such apologies in the broader context of family dynamics. Apologies are a tool for emotional processing, offering a pathway to acknowledge harm and, in rare cases, begin the journey toward reconciliation. In a courtroom setting, where stakes are legal as well as emotional, the act of speaking carries profound implications. For Nick, it was both a personal reckoning and a public act, one that could shape how he was perceived by the law, by his family, and by society at large. As Nick spoke, small but significant details emerged about the family's inner workings. He referenced moments of misunderstanding, unspoken conflicts, and personal struggles that had remained hidden from public view. Each revelation added depth to the narrative, illustrating that the tragedy was not a simple matter of malice or impulsivity, but a complex interplay of emotional, psychological, and familial factors. The audience, whether in the courtroom or watching from afar, began to see the human context behind the headlines. The reactions from Jake and Romy were subtle yet profound. Their expressions shifted between grief, shock, and moments of tentative understanding. This silent communication underscored the complexity of familial bonds, the simultaneous presence of love and anger, loyalty and betrayal, grief and the search for meaning. The courtroom, often viewed as a sterile space of procedure, became a stage for raw human emotion, where the intricacies of family life, unfiltered and unavoidable, were laid bare. One particularly striking moment occurred when Nick addressed the impact of his actions on his siblings. "I know I have caused pain that can never be undone," he said, his voice breaking. This acknowledgement was not just about legal responsibility. It was about the emotional devastation wrought on the very people who loved him. The statement highlighted the ripple effect of tragedy, that one act can fracture multiple lives, leaving long-lasting emotional scars that no court can fully remediate. Legal observers noted that the framing of such apologies could influence subsequent proceedings. Expressions of remorse may affect sentencing considerations, jury perceptions, and the broader narrative surrounding the case. While the facts, evidence, timelines, and charges remain central to legal judgment, human emotion and acknowledgement of harm can add context that shapes outcomes, particularly in high-profile cases with intense media scrutiny. The courtroom drama intensified as the layers of revelation unfolded. Nick spoke of isolation, stress, and moments of emotional vulnerability that had gone unnoticed. He acknowledged mistakes, miscommunications, and decisions that, in hindsight, led to irreversible consequences. These moments were not just confessions. They were explorations of human behavior, revealing how ordinary pressures, emotional struggles, and familial dynamics can culminate in tragedy when left unaddressed. Public reaction to these revelations was complex. Some expressed sympathy, recognizing the interplay of mental health and familial tension. Others were skeptical, questioning whether explanations could mitigate the horror of the alleged actions. The duality of response, compassion versus judgment, reflected the broader human struggle to reconcile understanding with accountability, particularly when faced with extreme acts of violence within a family. By the end of the session, the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer solely a site of legal procedure. It had become a space of storytelling, emotional confrontation, and human revelation. The apologies and explanations offered a lens into the Reiner family's private life, exposing the tensions, love, and vulnerabilities that underpinned a public tragedy. For the surviving siblings, the moment was both excruciating and necessary. A confrontation with reality, a step toward processing grief, and an acknowledgement of a sibling's humanity, even amid devastation. Yet, despite the depth of apologies and revelations, questions remained. How would the legal proceedings continue? What role would mental health evaluations play? How would public perception shift, as more details emerged. The courtroom had revealed much, but it had also set the stage for further drama, deeper exploration of family dynamics, and moments of truth that could not yet be predicted. And what came next? The hidden tensions, shocking confessions, and emotional confrontations that would continue to unfold in the courtroom would push the story into even more uncharted and heart-wrenching territory. And no one saw it coming. Behind the gilded walls of the Reiner estate, behind the smiles and public image of a successful, loving family, there were tensions that no one outside the household could have imagined. The tragedy that struck on December 14th was shocking not only because of its brutality, but because it exposed a side of the family that had been carefully hidden from the world. What the public saw, a cohesive, supportive Hollywood family, was only part of the picture. In reality, the Reiner's household, like any family, contained complexities, disagreements, and pressures that would later take on deadly significance. The first hints of these hidden tensions began to surface during the courtroom proceedings, as witnesses described interactions and relationships that revealed subtle strains in the family dynamics. Friends and extended family painted a picture of a household that, while loving, was not immune to conflict. The pressures of fame, career expectations, and individual struggles combined to create a volatile environment, particularly for Nick, whose living situation in the guest house both provided independence and fostered isolation. Nick's relationship with his parents was complex. Rob and Michelle Reiner were devoted parents, but they were also high-profile figures, accustomed to managing public scrutiny, career demands, and social expectations. For Nick, growing up in this environment meant navigating the weight of expectation alongside personal identity and emotional development.